So welcome to On the Couch with Aleks, our sex therapist, joining us today. Before I get into introducing Aleks, I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians on the land in which we meet, live and work. For me, where I'm sitting today, it's the Wadi Wadi people of the Dharawal country, and we recognise their powerful connection to waters, land and sea, and of course to community. We would like to pay our deepest respects to elders past, present and emerging, to families, communities and survivors, and to those that never made it home. As we share in our own knowledge, teaching and learning in this space today, may we also pay respect to the knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of country. I think it's really important as well to acknowledge that we're all here with multiple hats. As always, I like to acknowledge that we are all joining today with diverse personal and professional experiences to reflect on and draw on when we're discussing sex and relationships. If you've been following Caddyshack Project for a while, it'd be no surprise that we're interested in the sexology space. I'll give a bit of a definition to kind of settle us in to this session. Sexology is a scientific study of human sexuality. It includes human sexual interests, behaviours and functions. You may have read our blog, noticed in our newsletter or followed some of the tags that we share on social media. Don't worry, none of that is a prerequisite for today's session, but it's always there if you'd like to go back to read a little bit more. Think of today's session as a bit of a visual podcast. I'm joining you on the actual couch today, but sit back, get comfortable, and I guess just enjoy this hour of your day really dedicated to learning about how we can be sex positive in the work that we do. I'd like to welcome our guest for today's On the Couch session. Aleks is a certified sex therapist and clinical counsellor. Her therapeutic practice is sex positive, trauma-informed and guided by multiple evidence-based therapeutic approaches. It's my honour to sit with Aleks on the couch today and chat with you, Aleks, about sex and pleasure and relationships. So welcome, Aleks.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here, and thank you for your welcome to country and acknowledgement. I would also really love to add to that I want to acknowledge all the brave queer souls that have fought for our rights to speak openly about sex, sexual health and relationships, those people that have essentially lost their lives as well in that fight. So I feel incredibly privileged to be having this conversation today.
Yeah, love that. Thanks so much. I think rather than reading out your very professional and impressive qualifications list in your bio, I think maybe a better place to start is to hear a bit of a backstory. We love a backstory at Caddyshack Project. We love hearing about how you've landed in the sex therapy space. So can you share that?
Absolutely. So I was doing an undergraduate degree in psychology at Sydney Uni, and it was, am I allowed to swear in this?
I'll cut it out, but yeah.
Okay. I'll just try really hard not to. It was really boring and dry. So I essentially had a bit of a quarter life crisis where I was like, am I even supposed to be in mental health? I'd always been interested in it. But in undergrad, I did a careers quiz online, and it was like, you should work in mental health. And I was like, oh, okay. Well, at least I'm on the right pathway. And then along the sidebar of the careers quiz results, it suggested all the different pathways you could take. And one of those was sex therapy. And I was like, what in the hell is that? Looked into it and was like, oh, it's talking therapy. You focus on sexual function, sexuality, relationships. And I just thought, how wonderful to be able to have those kinds of taboo conversations, which I think in small, safe spaces, people are having anyway, but to kind of create, I guess, more of a space for that. So then I went on to do a master's in counselling to get my mental health qualifications, but I wrote a thesis on female sexual dysfunction in that master's. So it was a research master's. And then I went on to do a postgrad in sexology, which was then the sexology certification.
Right.
I kind of, and I did a 2-year internship with a sex therapist here in Sydney. Her name is Tanya Cones. She's my supervisor. So I had some like sort of interning experience in undergrad.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
I just love hearing about how, if we could go through, I mean, we're not going to do it today, every single person in this in this webinar, like how did you end up in your role? And tell me about, oh yeah, and I did some, burger flipping and pizza making and all of the
totally. I was in hospitality for the 10 years that I was studying, like it was, and then I started working. Yeah, I started working as a therapist. Now I have lower back issues because I have to sit down.
Oh dear.
Love that.
Oh dear. Yeah. So I think I heard a few of those key terms, and I think it might be a good place to start with some terminology. We hear about sexologists, sex therapy, body therapist, sex coach, sex worker. These are all terms that just kind of get thrown around. Can you give us like a brief, main difference between what they are and what you do?
Yeah, sure thing. So sexology is essentially the umbrella term of the study of human sexuality. And then under that umbrella, you have different pathways. So you can have the sex therapy pathway, which is where you need sexology plus mental health certification, sex education, which is sexology plus education degree. Sex coaching can be studying through like an institute, which is just about like somatic sexology. So that sex coaches don't necessarily have a degree in like a mental health or education certification, but they have studied like a equivalent to a degree in sex coaching. Sexological body workers provide one-way touch, and they will have studied sexology, but then also they're looking more at like the physiology of what's happening with sexual function. And then sex workers are people who it's two-way touch, and that's not necessarily focused on things like education or like therapy, but a lot of sex workers can play a very important role in terms of working collaboratively with some of those other professionals. For example, if you have someone who arrives to therapy with very little sexual experience, they may want a safe space to explore sex and sexual activity, and they may employ a sex worker to guide them through that.
And is that something that you all kind of crisscross over and know of each other and refer to each other?
Yeah, so it's kind of like a multidisciplinary approach to sexuality at times, for sure. The other sort of professionals that I would collaborate with include pelvic floor physios. So those are physiotherapists that specialize on the pelvis and the muscles around the pelvis, and that's really important for people who present with sexual pain. And sometimes even, like, I guess you can almost, it really just depends on the client presentation, but I think the more sort of holistic your approach to a client presentation is, the better.
Love that. Everything that I wanted to hear was in that little bit.
Right.
Thank you. I guess, a question that we get asked a lot as sexual health promotion officers is people want to know what we do on a regular work day. And they're like, okay, well, and what is health promotion? Like, but what do you actually do? Like, what do you do when you show up to work? So I think, part of that is really people love getting a glimpse behind the curtain. And, we put out on social, in our social marketing strategy, this is what it looks like, but actually what is the nitty gritty behind that? So I'm going to ask you the same question. Take us behind the scenes. Tell us what like a typical day as a sex therapist or, as part of your work.
Yeah, sure. So I guess my like, maybe it's easy to talk about my week because it's varied in what I do. So the main component to my work is client facing work. So I work with individuals and couples in private practice, providing talking therapy 2 days of the week. That's on Zoom, telehealth. 1 day of the week, I have a therapy room in Surrey Hills in Sydney that I'll do in-person sessions. So the sort of average day there looks like me waking up, making a cup of tea, walking the dog, going to
Love that.
yoga. And then my sessions usually start at midday and they go through until 7 p.m. at night. And my sessions are 50 minutes each. So I have like little breaks in between.
Okay.
And then on, for example, yesterday is like a bit of an admin day for me, where I will organize content for social media. I get like contracted to write paid articles for different brands online. So that was a really nice start to the day. It's just sitting there having a cup of tea, writing an article on lubricants.
Nice. Yes. Yeah.
And then I'll do things like, for example, if I have some difficult client presentations, I'll be reading up on how to work with like porn use or something like that. It's just a sort of chance to like get on top of like the background stuff, I guess.
Yeah.
And then also creating content as well for other brands. So people want reels where I'm talking about certain products or concepts, sexual health related, and I get paid to do that as well. So there's a few sort of areas to my work, but that's kind of what the week looks like.
Yeah. And so do you have a team that you work with, or you have people who work with you?
Yeah, I have a social media manager / graphic designer, because what takes me like 5 hours to do on Canva takes her like 10 minutes. So I pay someone to, like, I give her the content, written content. I'm like, this is what I want you to just make it look sexy. And then she does that and it's wonderful. So that's why my Instagram looks good, is purely because of her. Yeah. And then
but you're behind it. Like it's all your content.
I mean, like, yeah, it's my content, but it's also like it would not look that good without her. So she's definitely a huge asset. Yeah. And so, yeah, I do. And then I have, there was a student reached out to me who wants to get into sex therapy. And she was like, I just want like some insights. So it kind of was a bit of a full circle moment from when I was interning for Tanya, to have someone be like, can I like just help you? I was like, oh my God, this is so weird. So she helps me out a couple of hours a week. I give her all the boring stuff, and then she does research, which she loves. And so I'm like, oh, can you research BDSM this week? I want to, talk about that. Like, I just need some notes. And that just like frees me up in the time that she's sort of working for me. I can then write a paid article.
Yeah. One of the things that I did want to talk to you about, which I might not, but I'm going to say it anyway, because I'm conscious of time. We've got an hour and it's a lot to get through, is talking around social media to reach and engage with your audience, and what tips you have for overcoming the climate of sex and relationship, or sex and pleasure censorship on social media. It's a huge one. I actually don't think there is an answer. That's why I'm thinking we might just move on. But I just want to make a real point that it's hard work really having sex in the title and getting it across, isn't it?
Yeah, it's really difficult, and there's a lot of censorship. I can't boost any of my like workshops or posts, like nothing can be advertised. So a solution to that now is that I am starting to use an app called Sunroom, which is designed by women for women and non-binary creators, because these are the populations that get targeted the most by censorship on Instagram. And it's a place where you can then also monetize the content that you're creating. So that's been my like somewhat solution at this point.
Okay. It's a tough one, because even when we're talking about sexual health promotion, we don't reach nearly as many people that we could be reaching because of sex in the title. Anyway, it's a personal moment for me. I'm going to move on before I go into a rant. Okay, big question now, and I think it's probably a question a lot of people here would like to know. Why would someone go to a sex therapist? Can you talk us through the most common reasons couples, individuals, groups access a sex therapist and book an appointment with you?
I can. And you know what was actually really funny? I had supervision the other day, and my supervisor, his name's Matt Tilley, he's based in WA, but he was like, I want you to look at the populations, like the presenting issues that are coming into private practice. So I literally have
no way.
a list right here. The most common.
This is not planned, everybody.
No, this is a complete like happy coincidence.
Yeah.
But essentially, the most common presentation in private practice are issues of desire. So I get both individuals and couples coming in reporting lower desire and sexual interest. The next most common thing is like relationship issues. So whether that be we're not having enough sex, we're feeling disconnected, our communication's not good enough, those kinds of issues surrounding relationships. I get a lot of sort of like anxiety, but that manifests in different presentations. So whether that manifests as sexual pain or erectile issues or trouble with orgasm or performance anxiety, it kind of, anxiety is a really common, I guess, component of the presentations that come in. I work a lot with eating disorders and body image. So I'm also a trained eating disorder therapist, and that's something that, I really enjoy working with, even though it's really difficult. I really enjoy it, but that's really common. So like body image concerns comes up a lot. And I also have a lot of people, what else do we have here? People questioning their sexual orientation, people having troubles with porn use, becoming too dependent, a lot of like sexual trauma and wanting to sort of re-enter sexual experiences safely. And then we also have things like issues with orgasm, erection, dating. I get a lot of people trying to navigate poly relationship dynamics, sexual pain, that kind of stuff.
And so a lot of those topic areas, I would imagine, are not a just quick fix, one appointment and you're done. It's like more of a long-term.
Yeah, absolutely. And for things like sexual pain, that's where it takes time, because you also have to set up a multidisciplinary approach to sexual pain. All the research shows that it's already a really difficult issue to work with, and it's key to have a team of people supporting the client. So it takes, like I have one client that I've been seeing for 6 months, and she's only just gotten herself a pelvic floor physio, because that's how much of the avoidance, again, anxiety, the avoidance creeps in, and she got overwhelmed by the idea of it. So it's just taken us 6 months to build a rapport to the point where she can kind of trust, okay, this is something I have to do.
Yeah, let alone trying to get in the books with something with another professional. Yeah. Just building off this, I think a big question really is, how do these sessions work with you? And I think they would probably be different depending on why someone has booked that appointment. But what might someone expect when they go to a sex therapy session? Is it varied? Is it tailored? I'm guessing that's, very tailored. Hands-on education, talk therapy.
Yeah. Look, I think sex therapy will really depend on the practitioner. So much like I guess general mental health support, it's really going to depend on the sort of trainings that practitioner has done, which is why I think it's really important to talk about the continuing professional development that you do, because it informs your practice. So generally speaking, though, what to expect is that in the first 2 sessions, I do history taking, where I go through the presenting problem, a sexual history with the client, which includes sexual health questions where they learned about sex, how they identify. We look at mental health history, medical history, family history. We look at sexual function as well. So what's happening with things like desire, arousal, masturbation, lubrication, pain, and then sexual dynamics. So I will literally be like, what generally happens in a sexual interaction between you and your partners. So yeah, that's kind of what to expect from the first couple of sessions. And then after that, it really is dependent upon the presentation of the client. I will kind of tweak my approach if I need to. But generally speaking, I do rely on like the same sort of sets of resources. It often does apply, because as I've mentioned, anxiety is such a common underlying component to any sexual function issues. So I'm often actually talking more about anxiety and shame than I do about sex.
And that's kind of not surprising, I don't think, after hearing what we know so far.
Yeah.
Totally. And I guess, yeah, really similar to mental health, you don't need to be in crisis, or you don't need to have experienced a trauma to access a therapist. And so I'm imagining that's the same in sex therapy, right? Like, you don't need to be like, oh, there's a real big issue. It's just part of your holistic sexual health.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, like a lot of, I think it's also nice because a lot of couples are coming in going, oh, we're in this new relationship and we just sort of want to maintain the communication. And so those are my favorite.
That's so good.
Come in being like, we want to do the work, but we're not in crisis. It's just because we value the relationship and know that communication is so important. I'm just like, oh, heaven.
I'm going to maybe jump back to maybe not so much of a heaven type client.
Sure.
When we're talking about trauma, we've had a couple of questions that have come through upon registration. I'm just having a look at my notes here, make sure I've got the right wording. One of the audience question is, how can trauma impact sex and relationships? And how do you work in that really important space with individuals and couples?
Yeah, okay. So I'll answer the first part of that question, which is, how does trauma affect sex and relationships? So trauma, and it doesn't have to be explicit sexual trauma. It could be some kind of emotional trauma, physical trauma from like a surgery or like difficult birth. It can be very varied. The way that it impacts sex is that it affects the nervous system. So I'd be happy to share with you the resources I share with clients, but it all comes from like polyvagal theory by Stephen Porges. So when we look at trauma, we're looking at the nervous system and how it's impacted. Is my client in a stress response when they enter any kind of intimate interaction with a partner? I had a client last week who said, every time I go into my bedroom, she lives with her partner, every time I go into my bedroom, I'm scared he'll come in as I'm getting changed and touch me. And so she started to become vigilant to the fact that her boyfriend, and he was literally like playful, like, oh, you're so cute, like running up, giving her a hug, a kiss, but she would go into like a full stress response. And so what we need to recognize is that trauma impacts how the body is feeling and interpreting certain situations. One of my clients put it really well: trauma severs your connection to your instinct. So people have a very difficult time interpreting events and making decisions about how to move forward, and their bodies will take over. How it affects relationships is that people may actually start to sit in their stress response of like a fawning or friending position. So this is where we're people pleasing, we're looking toward attachment figures for safety, but overall there's a sense of threat, even if it's mild, and we don't want to be entering sexual interactions if we're in that, if there's a sense of threat, because it enables a complex cycle and relationship to sex, that your partner is the threat, that sex is dangerous. So we want to actually be, then the second part of the question was, how do I work with that? A lot of education around just this. I give them the polyvagal theory. There's a YouTube video that I give them. I will talk them through the stress response, what that looks like in their bodies. So they're starting to build an awareness of like, oh, my body is tense. My shoulders just went like this. Okay, maybe my body is telling me it doesn't feel safe. My heart is beating, my breathing is shallow, like my mouth is dry. These are all your body is signaling, babes, we're not feeling too good here. So then we look at grounding and regulation skills. And after that, we look at so that's more of like the intrapersonal, their internal experience. We look at the interpersonal. So how are we then relating to people? Can we set boundaries to encourage safety? So for example, the client with the boyfriend that comes in every time she changes had to set the boundary of, I need you to not approach me when I'm getting changed unless I ask you to, right? So that was like using communication essentially. So that's sort of how it starts, and I could keep going, but
oh my gosh, it's so interesting. I mean, I'm thinking about all of the questions that we're really not going to get through today, because I could just hear you talk about that topic alone for the whole hour, like easily. And I love, you know, communication. We'll talk about that later. But also like the listening to your body stuff. Like it's, you know, it sounds so simple, doesn't it? But so important. And I think it's part of everything that we do is just to, you know, recognize that and listen to our bodies. There's another couple of trauma questions. So I think I'll stick with this kind of theme for the moment. Another one that's come through is, how do clinicians best support people with sexual violence-based trauma and history?
So I think the first thing that's really helpful is to go get training in like working with sexual violence if you haven't already, just to sort of understand the context within which the client is presenting. And I know there are some good places where you can do that. If someone's kind of coming in and you're looking on how to work with them, I think it's the first thing I do is build safety with the client. So if the outside world and the other relationships are dangerous, I want to feel like a safe space, right? So I will actually set boundaries and say, we're not discussing what like explicit experiences of trauma. We're going to just spend time talking in a way that you feel comfortable talking, right? So I'm not going to push the client like beyond their capacity.
Yeah.
So I don't want to become yet another perpetrator, if that makes sense. Like I don't want to violate or push their boundaries. So I'm going to
bring everything up repeatedly.
That's right. So I'm going to, even like when I do my sexual history intake, and I say, like in the first session, I'm going to ask you about if there are experiences of sexual trauma or trauma of any kind. You're welcome to answer that, but if you're not ready to, please let me know. We don't have to talk about it today or at all if you don't want to, you know. So I think the safety comes through creating those containers and being very explicit with your expectations with the client and establishing that sort of boundary of, I'm not going to push you for information. We're just going to move at your pace. So that's sort of the first thing I do. And to be honest, with I have a client that we literally didn't talk about sex for a year until she was like, I couldn't take a sexual history with her. She wouldn't do it. And I was like, that's fine. We won't do it. Like, and it was cool because we had other things that we were going to work on, like anxiety or like mood stuff. But after a year, she goes, Aleks, I'm ready. You can ask me the sexual history now. And I was like, okay, great, let's do it. And so it just took a year, and that was okay. I was happy to wait.
Building trust.
That's right.
Yeah, clearly building trust. And I think, you know, the second part of that question was around the most important thing with trauma-informed care. And I think we've answered that for sure. So thanks to our audience for writing those questions in. A couple other things that we did in preparing for today's webinar was to do a bit of a Google search and come up with some I would call it a hot list of questions around sex, pleasure and desire. And like I said, we could do an hour on each of those sessions. So we might need to get you back for next year.
Oh, please.
But let's dive in and try and destigmatize some of the myths in this space. The first one I think comes up, I'm speaking from my personal experience, but probably 90% of barbecues and sitting around a fire pit chatting with mates. How many times on average per week are people having sex? I don't know what it is, but I think maybe I want to know from you, Aleks, why is this such a common question? Why do we want to know? Why do we care? And does it even matter?
So I'll answer the first part. I remember reading research, it was a few years ago now, but the research stated that people, and this was a study on like marriages and long-term relationships. So this doesn't really accommodate to, and they're probably all straight and cisgendered too. So typical in research. But essentially the research showed that couples were having sex 1.2 times per month.
Wow.
Yeah. And I was always like 1.2 times. And then I would like make a joke to clients being like, oh,
what's the point two?
And so, Yeah, I don't know. I always share that stat because I think it really lowers the standard for people. People hold themselves at such an incredibly high standard for the frequency of sex in their relationships. You then asked, you asked a few other that you said, why do we care?
What did I say? I said, why do we want to know? Why do we care? And does it even matter? I think
Yeah.
that's what I said.
So I think we want to know because we're social creatures and we constantly make comparisons to our peers, right? We sort of set the bar based on what other people are doing, you know,
Or what
whether
they're
it's
saying that they're doing.
Yeah, or what they say that they're doing. Exactly. So I think a lot of unhelpful comparison occurs in relationships and specifically in regards to, you know, the success of our sex lives. I also think like pornography can influence people's expectations of sex massively. And I think the reason why we care is because we are wired for negative bias, right? So our brains, our nervous systems are constantly looking for things that aren't going well. And if we make these unhelpful comparisons and assume it's not enough, it sort of feeds into this, I guess, mentality around sex. I have a theory that when people say everything is great except for the sex, it's not actually about sex. Like when people are complaining about sex, it's not actually about sex. It's always about something else. It's always about the quality of connection, a sense of friendship in a relationship, communication. These things are more often the underlying issues as to why the frequency of sex has changed. There are also so many other reasons why the frequency of sex will change throughout the lifespan of a relationship. Stress, family, money, like illness, you know, like all of this stuff happens to us as human beings. I think it's unrealistic to expect ourselves to stay in the state of limerence that occurs in the first year of our relationship. The research shows that that only lasts for about a year, and that at the 2-year mark is when we start to sort of adjust to the relationship changing and growing. So I think it's almost like educating and just validating people, being like, you know, it's okay. Like you don't have to be having sex all the time.
Every
Like,
night. Yeah.
Also,
not
who's
the
paying
movies.
for that? Honestly, wild. I mean, if you can go for it, like,
yes.
praise be to you. But yeah, I think at the end, to answer that last question, it really doesn't matter. I think what I end up sort of telling people is that you just got to stick to your lane. What qualifies as a satisfying sex life is whatever feels and looks good to you and your partners, right? Like it doesn't need to include the rest of the world. They shouldn't have a say.
Yeah, the grass isn't always greener on the other
100%,
side.
100%.
And I guess now we're really kind of talking about sex specifically, and it might be a good time to ask this question, I think, while we're kind of in that first part of the webinar. How do we define sex? Because I think how we define sex really influences that previous question on how often we're having sex, right?
Yeah.
So how would you define sex?
Sure. So, I mean, I always ask this question. I ask a question to my clients. I say, you know, if your friends said they went on a hot date and they had sex, what behaviors do you imagine happened? And they'll go, oh, I don't know, I guess there was like some kissing and maybe like, you know, some other behaviors, but mostly like penetration.
Yeah.
And I imagine that like there was ejaculation or orgasm. And so then we might go, okay, well, if sex is therefore defined by the presence of penetration, orgasms, and ejaculation, like what does this sort of mean for the quality of our sexual interactions? And also, if penetration by a penis in a vagina is what qualifies as real sex, what does this mean for the queers? Like, are they just all virgins? Like, how does that work? You know? So
you said the word virgin, not me. Just saying. Virgin.
Virgin. Yeah. So, but even like looking at like, oh yeah, that's all, again, all this conditioning that we've received around like, if you haven't been penetrated, you're not sexually active somehow. Like it just, there's so many problematic messages that we've received. And so we'll then unpack all of that and just be like, hold on a second, then what actually qualifies as as a sexual experience. And when we peel it all back, people will often notice that sex can be defined based on like their own set of what they think qualifies. And that could look different for different people. And that's totally fine. I've also noticed, like, when I ask people when they first became sexually active, they'll often say to me, when I lost my virginity at age whatever. And I'll say, well, you know, I'd be curious, were there any earlier sexual experiences? Because those are still sexual experiences, you know, like it doesn't have to be defined by penetration, by a penis. So that's when they'll be like, oh yeah, I guess I did actually have some earlier experiences. And a lot of the time it's like, and they weren't necessarily with like just one gender identity, you know?
Yeah.
That sort of, then we talk about, I guess, like the fluidity of sexual orientation at times. So yeah, that's how I don't really have a definition for sex because I feel like it is subjective. But I encourage people to consider taking penetration, ejaculation, and orgasm off a pedestal and placing it on the table with all the other sexual behaviors.
Yeah, I love that. And I like the idea of defining it for yourself as well. I was kind of thinking about a global definition of sex, but I actually really like just hearing you speak. Everyone's going to define sex differently. And some of the things that I was thinking of was intercourse, penetration, but outer course and solo sex and intimacy and, you know, group sex, and kind of moving right along to masturbation when I say solo sex, self-pleasure. I love that that's included in the definition of sex, depending on who is defining it for themselves. But I guess growing up in media, movies, TVs, magazines, we only really hear about boys having a wank, but we know that all genders masturbate. So why do you think there is such a big stigma around masturbation, and how can we start to change that in our work and the way that we talk about sex?
Okay, big question.
Big question, I know. That's why I needed to say it now and not 5 minutes before we finished.
Yeah, no, because I think it's the way that we relate to masturbation and self-pleasure is so complex and historical. Like, I'm thinking of, have you read that book, Sapiens?
No, I haven't, but we'll add it to the list.
It's so random to refer in this conversation, but I promise it connects. Essentially, he's talking about like the history of humanity and how we've gotten to where we are today. But during the sort of like medieval times, when we started to really like formulate religious moral frameworks in our, and how that informed our thinking, we viewed, at the time, they viewed the mind as pure because we could think morally and make decisions, but the body as dirty because the body, that's not a word, the body, you know, excretes urine and poo and saliva, but it's also like it was animal in a way. That connected us to like lesser beings, is to sort of like have this function. And so sex was seen the same way. It was like sex was like dirty.
Like, ew. Any Schitt's Creek fans out there? Like, ew.
Ew. Yeah. Ew, David. Ew. Yeah. So essentially this is where like our relationship to, and the kind of discrepancy, the separation of our mind and body began, which is kind of ironic because now we've done like full circle and we've just been like, hold on a second, they're connected. Like we need
of course,
to connect our mind and bodies, not keep them separate. And I think that coming to masturbation, that's what really informs the stigma around masturbation, is seeing the body as dirty, as bad, as wrong, as immoral, you know, to kind of like experience self-pleasure, when actually there are so many benefits to masturbation that it's insane. Like if you could put the benefits of masturbation in a pill, people would take it every day.
Of course, yeah, because someone would be making money from that.
Oh yeah, pharmaceuticals would be jumping onto that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. I think there could be a whole webinar on debunking masturbation myths.
Yeah.
But we won't have time for that today.
I just wanted to, the second part of the question that I didn't answer, which was how do I work with it?
How do we change that in our work? I think I think about all of the different people we've got online today. How can we change? Is it the language that we use? Is it we just talk about it more openly?
Yeah, I think definitely the language that we're using. So when I start to talk about masturbation with a client, I'll introduce language, masturbating, mazzing, flicking the bean, you know, wanking, and they all kind of contribute their own language. So I'll use the client's language. So for some clients, they want me to say self-pleasure. For other clients, they want me to say, you know, wanking, but it's like using the language that they sort of relate to. Then also debunking the beliefs we have around masturbation. But I also encourage people to start slow with reconnecting to their bodies. So one thing that I get them to do is like a kind of like a 5 senses exercise, grounding exercise, but you just notice 3 things per day that bring you pleasure. And it can be non-sexual. So, you know, you might have like a nice cup of tea or cup of coffee in the morning, noticing the sensation of that in your body and how it feels, and just checking in with that sensory experience. That's one way that I might slowly integrate someone into reconnecting with their body in a sensual, pleasurable way.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess, you know, when we think about solo sex, we often think about sex toys. It's a choice, I guess, whether you do or you don't. And I guess it's more really about that exploring your body. I'm noticing there's a few comments in the chat, but I think Jen and Naomi are on it. Why don't we hear about using sex toys in partnered or group sex? Why is it so, like, when you're thinking about masturbation, you think about sex toys and we're not kind of talking about it in partnered sex?
I think because we're often sold the idea that partnered sex to include toys somehow means that partnered sex is lacking. And so like a toy is a replacement almost. Like people,
it's like a competition.
Yeah, it's like people become threatened by the idea of integrating sex toys into the sexual repertoire, which I definitely challenge with people, because I encourage them to sort of reframe it as a sense of, you know, like additional resources to an already great experience. But I think it's also, I will also educate people on the orgasm gap, because I think a lot of what stops like women and female identifying is that, or just anyone with a vulva, essentially means that like in partnered sex, they're often not integrating the use of sex toys when it could actually facilitate a lot of pleasure. So it's almost like encouraging that. Again, I think this is the whole like making comparisons. I shouldn't need sex toys, like these weird beliefs that just come up. And so we'll just challenge all of that and be like, let's look at what your body needs and what you want, and let's just advocate for that.
Yeah. And I guess, you know, we obviously can't talk about sex without talking about communication. And we know how important it is, but I think something that comes up often is, how do we do it when you're working with your clients? What are some of those methods and tips that you share for communicating your wants, needs, and desires? If it's, you know, to include sex toys, if it's to, you know, have different kind of experiences, how does this communication actually happen?
Sure. So when I'm working with clients and we're looking at improving sexual communication, I always start by encouraging them to have conversations before a sexual interaction. I find a lot of people assume they should be communicating during sex, and like on the spot being like, oh, I want you to actually do this. It's like, babe, slow it down. Let's just like reel it in a little. So creating containers for conversations to happen. So, you know, would it be okay if we discuss the kind of sex we want to have tonight after this day, or like however you want to sort of open the conversation? I call it having like an erotic conversation, because a lot of people think it has to be mechanical. So I would really like you to move a little to the left when you're licking my clitoris. Like, no, it doesn't have to be like that.
I mean, it can be if that's what works.
I mean, sure, but more often than
maybe not.
Yeah,
No.
but more often than not, people come back and they go, that was so erotic. Talking about like what I wanted done or what I wanted to do to them, or hearing what they wanted to do to me, they're just like, oh my God, that was like so erotic. I'm like, yeah, it's really fun to communicate. It's amazing. So we'll always encourage having a conversation before, checking in during the sexual interaction, and then again after the interaction. What that looks like is, hey, what do we want to happen today? During, is this still good to do? Do you still want that to happen? Or did you want to like maybe just like not do that today? Afterward, what worked well, what didn't? That kind of thing.
Yeah. And then I'm thinking about the flip side of that, probably more in those pre-conversations, like not when you're actually in the bed about to have sex, maybe not the time to have that conversation, but the importance of how we respond rather than react to that communication or those needs to something that might be a little bit different to what you've been currently. I'm talking mainly we're coming into more partnered or partners relationships rather than just, you know, someone that you met online.
Like, I guess it can also apply to casual relationships as well. I think the most important thing to do if someone is initiating a conversation around sex is to show curiosity and compassion. You know, if someone's kind of going, oh, like I'd love to sort of talk about sex, I'm finding like I'm struggling to reach orgasm or something. I think people might get like a bit defensive of like, what do you mean? Like, why didn't you tell me, like, or whatever? But actually what we want to do is kind of treat it like, oh, you're cluing me into what can make this experience better for the both of us. Great. Like how, you know, you're being vulnerable, you're communicating. So I'm going to show you that respect, that curiosity, that compassion. And it's an opportunity to learn more about the person you essentially want to get weird with, you know, like how great.
And I guess it opens up that conversation, or it opens up the opportunity to then go, oh, well, they've shared something there. And well, actually, I've also been thinking this. Maybe this is something we could just, so it's just an opportunity, isn't it, really?
Yeah, you can work together. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Something that I'd like to take us back to an early part of the conversation, we've got about 10 minutes left. And it's something that I've been reading in your blogs, and I would encourage anybody who's online today, we're not going to get through everything in the hour, but jump on Alex's blogs. They're great. I've spent, you know, a whole Friday afternoon deep diving in there. Can you take us back and tell us about queering sex? I love this idea of queering sex. What happens when we flip the heteronormative script? What is queer theory? Tell us about it.
Okay, so this was like an idea that I came up with based on like queer theory, which is all about subverting the norm, right? So queer theory wants you to take something from society that you've been taught and to just flip it, to challenge it. It's like anarchy. It's great. I love it. So what I kind of thought was a lot of people are given a bit of a heterosexual script regarding sex and the repertoire, even no matter like no matter how they identify, right? Everyone is often conditioned with a bit of a heteronormative script around sex, which means there's usually kissing, there's touching. If we're lucky, there's some outer course, but it's mostly centered around penetration of a penis in a vagina. And then there's usually an ejaculation, and if we're lucky, an orgasm. So what we want to do is, it comes back to that idea of taking things like penetration, ejaculation, orgasm off the pedestal. And what I encourage, the analogy I use is like, it's like the heterosexual sex menu is like this entree, main is penetration, dessert is an ejaculation, right? And we want to go, okay, this is limited. I don't want to eat the same menu day after day or 1.2 times a month.
Yes.
So essentially what we want to do is we want to put all sexual behaviors on a buffet. And if you've ever been to Las Vegas, they have like the most amazing breakfast buffets. Like you walk in, they have like the, you know, omelet station, continental breakfast bar, but they'll also have like a sushi bar and then like a Christmas ham and like roast veggies and like dessert, like cake. And there's just everything that you could want in this buffet. And this is how I encourage people to see sex, is that you walk up to your buffet with your partner, with your little tray, and you go, all right, darling, what would we like in this sexual interaction? Shall we have some fingering? Shall we have some kissing? Should we have a massage? Do we want toys? Do we want some aftercare? you know, what are we going to put on this tray for this eating experience that we're about to have? Because our desires are going to change with every interaction that we have. We can't just prescribe this sort of menu of sexual behaviors and assume that it's going to, I guess, be satisfying every time, because our needs change, our moods change, whatever. So that's kind of how I encourage people to reframe seeing sex. And the way that they can practically do that is I give them a sexual repertoire table. So if you imagine a bingo sheet, if you will, but instead of numbers, it's sexual behaviors. But it's everything from like kissing, cuddling, to fisting, toys, aftercare, like whatever you want on this table.
All of it.
You put all of it there, and then you circle, like, I'm in the mood for this, I'm in the mood for this. What are you in the mood for? Compare your bingo sheets. Oh, look at that. We have things in common. Let's do that. So that's how I kind of guide people through the communication.
I think that's brilliant. And doesn't it make it easy when there's an analogy and something we can visualize? You can be like, oh, yeah, actually, no, I do want cake for breakfast. I absolutely want cake for breakfast and a Christmas ham.
Yes. And it's
actually,
like,
no, I don't want that.
Yeah. And I think also what's really great about the queer sex buffet concept is that no matter what you put on your tray, it qualifies because it's what suits you, you know? So if people are like, oh, we just want mutual masturbation, most people wouldn't regard that as we had sex. Then it's kind of like, no, you did, you know, this is a sexual behavior. You quantified it as a sexual behavior and it happened. So therefore it's a sexual experience, you know?
Yeah, I love that idea. Absolutely. Sexual function, I feel as though we might have to, there was a few questions that have come through, and I think what we might do is have a bit more of a written response, because I think we're talking about people with a disability, we're talking about teenagers and body acceptance and self-confidence, which is huge. There was also a question in there about working with young men and how you overcome the challenges of working with young men. Great questions. I think we could probably whip them up in a follow-up email, because I don't want to miss out on time talking about referrals and how we can, you know, where do we go kind of thing. So I imagine as a sex therapist, you have a real toolbox of referrals and resources on hand. One of the things we do at Caddyshack Project is always try and link people onto accurate and trustworthy information, you know, in our newsletter, website, blog, social media, stuff like that. And I think, you know, just having a look at your website is totally the same in terms of connecting and linking, because that's what it's all about. So I guess my question really to wrap up this conversation is, how can workers best talk to clients about sex and relationships and make those referrals?
I think so if you haven't already, looking into the PLISSIT model. So I think that PLISSIT model is PLISSIT. It's an acronym for how to structure like conversations around intimacy, sex, and relationships. So you guys can Google that. But that's a really good sort of framework for how to sort of talk about sex with people and get an idea of their needs. And then once you know what their needs are, I think it really is a case of that reflection of like, is this something I can actually work with? Because if it's not, there's probably someone else out there who can offer better support. So in terms of sexual function, sex and relationships, I'm constantly referring out to pelvic floor physios, you know, other couples therapists, because there can be people that, I mean, like I have very niche areas of specialty, like body image, eating disorders, like sexual function and relationships. But there are some people that can specialize in things like IVF. So if I've got a queer couple have come in, but they're about to go through IVF, it's probably not my area of expertise. So I'm going to refer out to, you know, practitioners I know who can support them around that. I think it's just about the case of like talking and networking and chatting and even just Googling people and being like, who can maybe help? I think it's a really important part of supporting your clients, but in no way does that sort of invalidate the work you do with them. It's just about like strengthening that sort of multidisciplinary approach.
And I guess recognizing that a lot of people, I'm not sure if we have any other sex therapists in the room today, but I'm sure we've got community workers, youth workers, social workers. Like there are so many things, isn't there? There are so many things, and sex is just one of those things. And knowing that we don't have the answer to everything, but we can find out together. Maybe we're going to jump on Alex's website. There might be a really good blog. There might be a good link through here and kind of navigate that in a way together. And that kind of, you know, we're not all experts, right?
No, we're not all experts, and that's why I think it's great to just, and also it's just so nice to connect with other practitioners, you know, and just be like, oh, hi. Like, honestly, I've actually met a lot of practitioners through Instagram, just like following their Instagrams and then being like, hey, it looks like you would be great. Can I refer this client to you with this kind of presentation? And that's happened to me as well. So like, it's crazy how social media even plays a role in our referrals. But yeah, I definitely think it's a really important part of working with sexual health and sexuality is to sort of give your clients that added support. Sure.
And I'm guessing that you've built, I guess, I want to say library or a whole contact list, and I think that's ever growing, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's because you just never know what's going to walk through the door, what kind of presentation. So yeah, it's great to just, I think, have like a network of practitioners you can refer out to, and them to you as well. Yeah,
especially when we're thinking about, you know, you never know who's going to walk through the door, but when we're talking about, you know, disability or intellectual disability or young men or older couples, or, you know, there's just so many people who access this service, right?
Yeah, and that's something that I always say to clients in the very first session. I'm like, you know, we're doing our history taking, but if it gets to the end of this session and you don't feel like I'm the right therapist for you, you can let me know without justification that you don't want to return, and I will help you find another practitioner.
So important.
Right? Because I'm like, I don't want you, I mean, we're talking about such an intimate part of your experience, and I want you to feel safe and comfortable enough to make the most of this service. And if I'm not the right person, I'm not going to take that personally. Like, you know, you can be the juiciest peach in the world, and there's always going to be someone who doesn't like peaches. So it's just like, that's fine. I'm not going to take it personally, but let me help you, because I know how hard it can be to find, you know, the right kind of practitioner.
Has to be the right fit. Yeah,
for sure.
Well, Aleks, I think we're wrapping up our On the Couch session with you today. I know the CLINICIANS team and our audience would all join me in thanking you for sharing your experience working in this space, and it's just been so great. I've just, you know, I haven't written any notes, but I'm listening back to this recording straight away, finding all of the notes. It's been a real pleasure to chat with you today. I really do feel like we could chat for hours, and let's book another one in for next year. Just saying, I'm just going to make that call now. I'm just going to do it.
Sounds like a plan. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
It's been so good. And as always, Jen will be sending a follow-up email to all of the participants with Alex's details, the links that we've talked today. There were some really great questions we didn't get to, so we will put that in the same email with a bit of a response. A lot of that stuff are in blogs that Aleks has written already. Definitely check out Instagram. And that's it for today. Thanks so much again, and we'll see you, or please join us for On the Couch session on the 19th of October with Curly Saunders. It's going to be another great conversation, and I can't believe we're already at this end of the year. Wild.
Crazy.
Wild. But thanks so much, everyone, and we'll see you next time. Bye.